Okay, what do you think, Imogen?
Yeah, we can start anytime. Yep.
Okay.
Okay, right. Well, hello and welcome to our webinar, to our audience and to our panelists. Our title today is Save Antibiotics, the Time is Now. Now, some might say we're at 5 minutes to midnight to find solutions to antimicrobial resistance, others that actually were already at 5 past or even later. So today we're going to talk challenges. Why do companies developing new antibiotics so often end up bankrupt? And solutions, for example, are repurposed antibiotics, our great hope. Now, to discuss this, we've got a fantastic panel, but don't worry, later on in the webinar, we'll also be taking questions from the audience. But first, let's introduce our panelists. We have Seamus O'Brien, who's Research and Development Director at GARD-EP, that's the Global Antibiotics Research and Development Partnership. We've got Lord Jim O'Neill, who led the UK's Antimicrobial Resistance Report, Anthony Coates, Professor of Medical Microbiology at St George's University of London, and Peter Beyer, who is Unit Lead at the World Health Organization's Antimicrobial Resistance Department. My co-moderator, Dennis Molnar, he's also here. He's the former CEO of Paratek. It's one of the few surviving antibiotic biotech companies, and I'm sure he's going to tell us a lot about how he survived and perhaps others didn't. But just to explain the structure of this webinar so you know where we're going with it. To start, Dennis will begin by explaining the background and the context of our topic today. Then we'll hear from Seamus, Jim and Anthony, and then we're going to have a panel discussion. Peter Beyer will take part 2, led by Dennis. And never fear, your patience will be rewarded. Before we end, we will be taking questions from you in the audience. How do you submit them? If you go into the chat in Zoom, you can type in questions to all panelists. Make sure that I see them too, so that I can make sure that they do get put. And from there, time for me to stop talking. Without further ado, Dennis Molnar, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, Imogen, and thanks everybody for joining this webinar and our other panel speakers. We really appreciate everybody's participation. I've been in the anti-infectives business for a little over 20 years at this point. I actually started back in the late 90s at a company called Imogen Pharmaceuticals, which was looking to find new novel anti-infectives in the host defense systems of other species, and then moved to Paratek in 2001. And through that period of time, I saw a great deal of changes in the space. So when I started, virtually every major pharmaceutical company was involved in antibacterial research, certainly through the 80s and many of them well into the 90s. But over the last 20 years, that's completely changed. We now have very few large pharma companies, at least until the start of COVID, involved to any degree in antibacterials, and also just a minority in antifungals. And just to get an appreciation for the economics of it, when I started back in the late 90s, there were 6 antibacterial products that sold over €1 billion euros or dollars, when they were about the same at that time, annually in sales. Today, there are 0. Today, I would argue that there has not been a large pharma antibiotic introduced in the last 10 years. The few still in the business have older products or acquired a number of other technologies from outside. And so the internal pipeline is completely different than it was many years ago. But over that time, resistance has continued, as we know. We continue to see more resistance. We continue to see cross-resistance and multi-drug resistance, and even a few signs of pan-resistant organisms. And the mantle for antibacterial development has been picked up by either nonprofits, research groups and academics, or small pharma companies. And small pharma companies like Imogen and like Paratek that I worked at did a very nice job of bringing novel NCEs to the market. And we did so with pretty good gusto in the early days of this 21st century. Following the lead of Cubist, essentially was the little company that sort of made it big. Unfortunately, though, the products have diminished since Cubist's best days, and fewer and fewer small products from small companies have been approved, and we've seen a great deal of market failure since those companies have come to the market. So we've seen a continued stream, maybe a little bit less robust than it was, but we see niche products and we see commercial lack of success in the marketplace. And I think that can be demonstrated by the 4 bankruptcies that have occurred over the last year in antibacterials companies. Some of those products and companies have been picked up and taken further, but to a great deal, those pipelines that were behind it have gone dark for this at this point. I think that there's a fairly simple explanation for why things have begun to dry up, even in the face of resistance increasing. That's because it's continued to become extraordinarily expensive to develop a new product. We saw changes in restrictions and increased regulations from regulators, but also things have not gotten cheaper to do robust trials. And we find that an antibacterial, for example, at Paratek took about €500 million to bring to the market. In the first year that they commercialized the product, it cost over €120 million to commercialize it. And they sold about $11 million worth. This year, they're on track to sell 50 or 60, maybe with a little help from BARDA, a little bit more than that. And I think that this demonstrates the challenges, and Paratek is one of the successes in this space, the challenges of ever recouping the investment that it takes to bring a product to the market. And of course, there's also antibiotic stewardship and the desire for clinicians to reserve new chemical entities so that we don't overuse them early on and lose them for later. And I think all of these things have conspired to make NCE development very challenging. But resistance hasn't gone anywhere, and where can we look for other opportunities? And Anthony and his work, first at St. George's and later at Helperby, have proposed that combinations of existing products is another route, maybe to bridge the gap to new NCEs from other companies, maybe to bridge the gap for public-private partnerships or even big pharma to get back into the space. And I would argue that it's an interesting approach. That the tendency to think that multiple products will cost more than other products, I think is no longer the case when you can rely on the dossiers of existing products and then move them forward. And I would argue that the economics are much more favorable as well. And so I'd just like to sort of leave the group with the thought, if NCE development is a challenge, perhaps finding the optimal mix of the antibiotics that we have now, or combining an old antibiotic with an NCE in order to get synergy and better activity with some known efficacy and safety in the background, isn't an appropriate approach. And so I'll leave the panel with that. I think I've gone a little over my introductory time, and turn it over to our panel.
Seamus, O'Brien, it's over to you now.
Thank you, Imogen. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen. So good day to you, wherever you may be and whatever time of day or evening it is. I'm Seamus O'Brien, I'm the R&D Director for GARD-P. So what I thought I'd do in my time is I would briefly talk to you about our work developing existing, or as we have called them, recovered antibiotics as treatment options for priority drug-resistant infections. For those of you who don't know, GARD-P is a non-for-profit foundation that addresses the challenges of antibiotic resistance by working with public and private partners to both develop and deliver treatments based on both new chemical entities and/or recovered antibiotics to treat infections in key populations caused by the WHO priority pathogens. These include treatments for those serious healthcare-associated infections in adults, which are particularly impacted by antibiotic resistance, development of antibiotics to treat serious bacterial infections in children, and in particular, treatment regimens for clinically diagnosed sepsis in newborn babies. And lastly, sexually transmitted infections, including drug-resistant gonorrhea. Now, we started a program, I think it was about 3 to 4 years ago before I joined GARDP, called the Antibiotic Memory Recovery Program. And the initial focus of that program is to review projects from discovery right through to clinical via interviews with companies, with academics, and information searching, literature searching, to try to identify forgotten, underutilized, or abandoned antibiotics and antibiotic research and development programs. And this was seen as a bridge or complementary to existing and anticipated treatments that may be coming through. So candidates we identified as being of potential underwent assessment, preclinical and other additional non-clinical evaluation to see if we could select or confirm candidates for clinical development, including in combination where appropriate or where required. In parallel, we explored the challenges and the potential pathways required to provide access to these antibiotics as part of a treatment in priority geographies where these antibiotics that we identify were currently not already available. So we have done this. We've identified a number of recovered antibiotics which are either still undergoing final development to be clinical candidates, or they're about to actually enter clinical trials in the following key programs. In neonatal sepsis, we're looking at antibiotics in combination to be part of a new treatment regimen for the treatment of clinically diagnosed sepsis in neonates. We're also identifying candidate antibiotics, a particular existing antibiotic, to be developed through regulatory development pathways for antibiotics for children to confirm a safe and effective dose for that antibiotic for children. And then following on from that, to undertake studies in children to treat those XDR, MDR infections across different age ranges. We're also looking at other recovered antibiotics which may have potential to treat maybe second or third line for patients who have difficult to treat or resistant sexually transmitted infections. And we've been looking at candidate antibiotics which are available regionally, not available globally, and to see whether they have an option to be developed further as outside their limited geographical and outside their limited clinical application. So what I'm going to do is, I'm not speaking for very long, as you'll see. I'm just really going to finish on this last slide. This is our GARDP pipeline, which we published in April 2020. And if I can orientate you around the middle of the slide, this looks at our 2 programs under our title of children's antibiotics and neonatal sepsis. We're looking at 3 recovered or existing antibiotics, fosfomycin, flumexis, and amikacin. And we're looking to see if we can confirm those in combination for a large public health focused clinical trial, which we're hoping to start in January 2022. And we're going through the process at the moment of designing that study and writing the synopsis. We're also looking at an antibiotic called polymyxin B, and we're about to enter a regulatory agreed pathway with the EMA to confirm a safe and effective dose for that antibiotic across children of all ages. We're also looking at other potential recovered antibiotics for serious bacterial infections in children. And we're also looking at an antibiotic which is available regionally in Japan, which is used to treat second or third line, those infections, sexually transmitted infections, particularly gonorrhea, which are not responding to the current standard of care. We're looking to see if there are options to use that antibiotic in what I would describe as more of a salvage use. So I think that just demonstrates to you, if you look at our pipeline, the mix and the contribution that recovered antibiotics we bring to our pipeline. And we do think they can make a difference to addressing where there are significant unmet needs in terms of antibiotics for priority resistant infections. So I'm going to leave it there.
Seamus O'Brien, thank you.
And I should just say, sorry, this slide's very important.
Go ahead.
I'd wish to say thank you to all our donors and all our partners for all the support they give us in the program that you just seen. So thank you. Sorry about that.
No problem at all. Thank you to Seamus and to his donors. I know GARD-EP very well myself and the work they do. Our next speaker is Jim O'Neill. Unmute yourself.
The famous unmute yourself. Thank you, Imogen. I've only done about 5,000 of these since
we all forget it.
Let me just make 6 broad comments in the brief time I have, and I thank Anthony and others for inviting me to join you. First thing, and a lot of it is sort of 40,000 feet stuff. The first thing, as I'm sure many participants in this webinar know, amongst the things why the review I had the privilege of leading became so well known is we suggested in fact in our very first major paper, and it obviously featured throughout, that if we don't do something about it by 2050, there could be 10 million people a year, that's 10 million a year, dying, and it would cost the world an accumulated $100 trillion over 35 years. In the what is now nearly 4.5 years since we finished, until the past 12 months, until we had COVID, occasionally there would be some people suggesting that we were scaremongering and there wouldn't be anything like that kind of scale of economic or human cost. And I'm saying that sadly in the week when the number of people reported to have died from something to do with COVID has gone through 1 million. And in that sense, in the spirit, perhaps cynically, of never letting a crisis go to waste, this crisis shows you what is out there and what else may come if we don't treat the whole system of our health preventiveness and investing in it a lot more seriously. Secondly, in that regard, and to emphasize how serious AMR is even compared to COVID, and one wants to be careful about making such simple and perhaps inappropriate comparisons, but nonetheless I shall. According to the data that I keep track of, because the data is actually pretty weak about these issues all over the world, but in fact, the basis in which we made our 10 million death prediction was from a base of 700,000 people dying a year in 2015 from some kind of AMR-related infection. And actually, since then, the 2 parts of the world that one would imagine might have more accurate data than most, both the EU and the US, have actually now suggested that the number of people that are dying from AMR is quite a bit higher than the 25,000 that we assumed in each case. Actually, approximately around 35,000, according to data provided in the last 12 months in both the EU and the US. And if you use that rule of thumb and translate that to the rest of the world, which I would think is rather conservative, that would translate into more than 1 million people a year already dying from AMR. And so hopefully that, together with the first point, should make it pretty clear to more people than seems to be the case that this is something we can't fool around about trying to stop as being a problem. Third thing to say, and this goes to what I was really asked to talk about, what has been the progress since our review finished? As many people know that I like to broadly talk about it in terms of 10 big areas. I occasionally call it the 10 commandments of AMR. I would say, notwithstanding some of the points made already about early stage research, there are perhaps 3 areas where there has been some positive progress. Especially because of the support from BARDA and related initiatives, including those at Guard P and a number of others, including the ongoing support from the Wellcome Trust, which of course, amongst other things, financed our review. It does seem to me that there is more effort and money going into early stage research. I occasionally joke here in the UK, there are more universities that have started off AMR centres since my review finished than areas in which this British government has given devolved policies to around the country. And there are many, many of them. Secondly, with that, that I think from the anecdotal evidence that I see, there are more people being attracted to researching this problem, notwithstanding the really powerful problems that Dennis highlighted in his own brief comments and the failure of the market pipeline. And then the third area, which in many ways is the most pleasant surprise to me, there is some significant progress seemingly taking place in a number of parts of the world about the reduction of inappropriate use of antibiotics in agriculture. And that's true in Europe, surprisingly true in the United States, and even true in some parts of the emerging world in terms of not using last-in-line antibiotics for wasteful treatments in animals such as China. But unfortunately, the progress stops there. In other areas, including, of course, the whole mechanism for coming up with an incentive or a big stick to force pharmaceutical companies to treat antibiotic production more seriously, there has been endless talk, and at least until July of this year, virtually no progress whatsoever. As I'm sure a number of people are aware, and it would be remiss of me to not mention this, there was an initiative that came out of the International Pharmaceutical Association announced in July, which was the launch of $1 billion fund, although quite how that will be led and what it's geared at, as far as I know, remains to be determined and seen. But we still have an enormous gaping hole in that part of the challenge, as well as the whole issue of the appropriate diagnostics, vaccines, and so on. And then in addition, and of great concern to me, given that the initiative came on the back of our review, since the chaos started in the United Kingdom over Brexit, we have a complete absence of international leadership on the AMR issue after it having successfully appeared onto the G20 agenda during the days of my review. Hopefully, moving to the fourth point, if President Biden indeed emerges as the new US president, I have some modest hope that that may change. I'm not quite sure where this would apply to repositioned antibiotics, but as I'm sure a number of people here know, there is a not insignificant chance that something called, somebody's joked to me that it should be called the AMR Act, but it's being called the Pasteur Amendment, could be added to a COVID stimulus bill, in which in essence it would provide something very close to the market entry reward that we recommended was needed to break this logjam that's there in the new antibiotic pipeline problem. Fifthly, in that regard, and again in the spirit of never letting a crisis go to waste, we're all talking, meeting a day after the news of Pfizer getting through or presenting optimistic data on its stage 3 trial results. And of course, that shows you that what can be done when pharmaceutical companies really put their mind to something. And in my opinion, this is an opportunity not to be wasted as it relates to the AMR fight. And I call on pharmaceutical companies and our major policymakers to make sure that we don't end in this dreadful mess that we've had the past 12 months in AMR going forward. And then lastly, in that regard, and turning it over, I guess, to Anthony coming next, quite where repositioned antibiotics would fit in the incentive structure related to market entry rewards, I see very little discussion of, but from the little of what's gone into my rather silly brain about these things, remembering that I am no expert in the area, it has always seemed to me to be in the no-brainer category as to why they should be used, as indeed we have seen some signs of in some of the vaccines that are being developed to cope with COVID-19. So let me stop there, Imogen, and thank you very much again for having me on the call.
Lord Jim O'Neill, thank you very much. Some good news and some not quite so good news. Anthony, final introductory talk goes to you.
Thank you very much. I'm Anthony Coates, and I'm going to talk about the advantages of combinations of old drugs. And following on from Jim, there's a gaping hole, which I hope to be able to persuade you that combinations of old drugs can at least partially fill. So good morning and good afternoon to everybody, and thank you very much for attending this webinar. In 1863, a little boy was born on a family farm in North America. He was one of 8 children. He spent his childhood helping out on the farm and attending the local school. At the age of 12, his father gave him a pocket watch. He took it to pieces and then reassembled it. Soon he started repairing his neighbor's watches. Later that same year, he saw his first steam road engine. Must have been quite a sight. This stimulated him to build his own steam tractor in his workshop. But he thought, actually, the boiler is rather dangerous. So in the 1890s, he built his first gasoline-powered car. He assembled it, and this is important to note, he assembled it from already well-known components: a 4-horsepower gasoline engine, a buggy body, and 4 bicycle wheels. Then he announced, "I will build a motor car for the ordinary person's utility, rather than a rich man's luxury." 10 years later, he built the Model T Ford, which sold for $825 each, which is equivalent now to about $25,000. Eventually, he sold about 15 million of them, which was equivalent to about half of all automobiles on the road at that time. Now, this story is as relevant now as it was more than 100 years ago. As Dennis has said, the cost of making a new antibiotic is somewhere between 250 million to 1 billion. This is just too high. And this is a very expensive car. If we followed Henry Ford's model, we could use combinations of old components, in other words, combinations of old antibiotics at far lower cost, about 1/10 we've calculated. We could build the Model T Ford antibiotic combination. This approach has many advantages. First of all, its lower sales price means it would be affordable. Then it would have clinician and payer acceptance because the combination uses old familiar antibiotics. It is active against highly resistant bacteria. It may reduce the emergence of resistance. It is likely to reduce side effects in certain combinations due to the use of a lower dose, which is made feasible by including components that boost one another, called synergy. It's like a turbocharger. Fast preparation times are a characteristic, and low prescribing error rates since the drugs are in one formulation. Low marketing costs because of good clinician acceptance and the use of existing generic company sales forces. Like new chemical entities, combinations are patented and approved by the regulatory authorities such as the FDA, EMA, or indeed following up WHO guidelines. So in conclusion, combination of old and repurposed drugs is a viable alternative to new chemical entities, and their development should be run in parallel to the new chemical entities, just like GARD-P is doing. Funding bodies should support research and development of new antibiotics and also of combinations of old ones. Investors and generic companies should rejoin in the knowledge that they can get a good return from combinations of old repurposed antibiotics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and to all of our panelists. Really, really interesting different perspectives there. I'm going to hand over to my co-moderator now, Dennis Molnar, because I know you have some questions to our panelists based on what they said there.
I do. Thanks everybody for their introductions. A couple of questions that actually came in ahead of the call. And then of course, a few questions have come in during our time as well. Maybe for Lord O'Neill, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what pull incentives would be most likely to work if they could be introduced and applied to both new drugs and even combinations of older drugs in the fight against AMR.
Thank you, Dennis. Well, my base case is nothing other than what we recommended. I was thinking about it when you made your own introductory comments. It seems to me the rigorousness of the connection of our proposal of so-called market entry rewards, together with the kind of philanthropic support that's been done through NGOs, but also from governments at the push stage, would solve the problem that you're one of the few living survivors of that we see that's unfolding over the past 2 years. Because with my business hat on and being very familiar with what motivates finance and particularly the VC investing community, obviously people that want to value and take promising drug development to a later stage are just going to find it impossible unless there is an ultimate buyout for their VC endeavors. It's pretty normal across the whole world of business. And unless either pharmaceutical companies can behave differently, which I do not dismiss as being a possibility, and again, I think we see a bit of evidence of that during COVID-19, or governments put their hands in the pocket and decide to reward them with something in the vicinity of, I would say at the widest, anywhere from $500 million to $1.3 billion to cover the cost of development and production, we aren't going to solve the problem. And as I said in my comments, there's been a ridiculous amount of talk. My goodness me, I think I've heard more and read more talk about this than any other topic that I've been close to for the past 30 years, with a possible exception of football. But nothing's actually happened, which is why watching the initiative coming out of Congress, in particular, if we have Democratic leadership at the White House, complicated by what goes on in the Senate, could be very important, because from what I can understand of the so-called Pasteur amendments, it would be providing something close to $700 to $800 million for the right needed new antibiotics. As to how that would incentivize old and repositioned antibiotics, I don't know. As I said in my comments, and it'd be interesting to perhaps to hear Seamus talk about this amongst others, Peter also, as to how they would think about this, but because I certainly don't see any talk about it. Primarily the focus is always about the markets, to stimulate the market for new drugs.
Thank you. Well, that's a good transition, Seamus. I noticed that GARD-P is actually developing both combinations of older drugs as well as new drugs. And I wonder, from that perspective, what might be the post-approval strategy for an entity like GARD-P in order to help make these breakthroughs a success? Oh, Seamus, I think you're still on mute.
If Lord O'Neill can do it, I can do it as well. So,
Please call me Jim, by the way. I'm embarrassed when people call me Lord O'Neill.
So
unless I'm in the House of Parliament.
Okay, so yeah, maybe I can address it more from an access strategy rather than post-approval or post-market. I think from new chemical entities or recovered or existing antibiotics, I think what is common is a need to work in partnership. It is a substantial challenge that we face. So from our example, for new chemical entities, we work in partnership with companies such as Antibiotics and Moderator Pharmaceuticals, where we agree for GARD-P to have exclusive rights to a number of countries where we know that the antibiotic that we co-develop addresses a significant unmet need. There is a need to chart the course from the initial regulatory approval that you would get for maybe a core indication with a stringent regulatory authority such as the FDA. We need to chart the course there to approval in our countries of interest. There is a need to focus on a clinical and public health evidence generation plan to support optimal and appropriate use of that antibiotic at the level of the patient, particularly a patient who's got resistant infection of interest, and also at a priority population level. And pediatrics is obviously, children are a key focus for us. There needs to be a mechanism to support supply, distribution, maintenance of the product, and to cover all the requirements of a market authorization holder. And that's where we have a real challenge for non-for-profit foundations such as GARD-P, for both new chemical entities and also existing antibiotics. And we do need to address that. And I'll make a comment, if I've got time, briefly on existing antibiotics. I think for recovered or existing antibiotics, some of the requirements are similar, as I've outlined for new chemical entities. But I think from a GARD-P perspective, what I should say, firstly, we're not currently developing combinations of old drugs. We are developing recovered antibiotics that can be used in combinations in a treatment regimen. And I think that actually needs to be done first. There's not enough funding for studies to be undertaken to determine how we can use the antibiotics that we've got better. And then you may move, once you've determined how you use it better in a combination, to develop a fixed dose combination as a finished pharmaceutical product. So I think there are a number of steps that have to be taken first. And I think that distinction is important around developing antibiotics to use in a combination in a regimen versus developing antibiotics as a finished pharmaceutical product. So I think that's an important distinction to make, because once you look at a fixed dose combination as a finished product, you enter into a significant realms of regulatory requirements that need to be addressed. And I would refer everyone on the call today to a WHO document, which not just antibiotics, covered all therapeutic areas, which I think was published in 2005, which is an excellent summary. So I think, for antibiotics to be used in combination, in terms of what we do post first approval, the first question is whether an amendment to the label is required, or if the drug is going to be used within its label. Now, for recovered generic antibiotics that are being developed for populations such as children, or for particular indications, there is a need to determine whether the use is within the label or requires an amendment to the label, for example, to add pediatric wording or evidence to be used in children. So that may be the key development and access objective. It may be focused on providing evidence to support optimal use or regulatory approval to be used in a priority population such as children. Now, once you've got over the regulatory requirements to use the drug in a population such as children, and you provided evidence, you do for for a recovered or generic antibiotic, you do need a partner, and this is where we come back to the economic model for antibiotics, because a generic company needs to see the value to work with a non-for-profit such as GARP, to partner with us to make that drug available in countries, for example, where it may not be already available, to expand the use in a different population such as children. So that's something we're working through at the moment with a number of partners for some of the antibiotics I showed you on our pipeline slide. We still have a long way to go. Now, if we don't have a partnership with a generic company, what facility is there in place to help make existing antibiotics available for broader populations? And at the moment, there isn't any, and we need to work out how to do that. We're having discussions within GARP at the moment and with other partners such as WHO, looking at mechanisms to really address that issue. So I hope that made sense, Dennis, and answered your question.
It did. That's very helpful. We've had a couple of really good questions come in as we've been going through as well, and a couple of the themes that come to mind, or at least one of the themes that comes to mind, is who might be interested in participating today in the market. Jim mentioned that big pharma companies will hopefully come back, and I'm hopeful that people will see that trying to address the COVID challenges worldwide, maybe we have the time to think a little bit about how to address the bacterial challenges, and that maybe some of these companies that built our antibiotic armamentarium decades ago will come back in. But in the interim, Seamus, you mentioned generic companies, who could come in and participate, and what would that private entity look like? And I wonder, Anthony, if you have a perspective on that.
Yes, thank you, Dennis. So generics companies may well be interested. I mean, on the grounds simply that they already sell approved drugs, which are the antibiotic components in a combination, whoever is developing the combination. And so many generic companies are familiar with the antibiotics in combinations and have sales forces which sell these drugs as monotherapies. And so it does seem to me that they, if they wished, they could use the same sales force and sell them in combinations. And this is really important, because it is what has actually sent these companies bust in the last 2 or 3 years is mainly the cost of actually doing their own marketing. It costs them, tens of millions a year. And so I think the answer really to that question is discussions have got to take place with the generic industry, which is actually very different to the big pharma industry. I know big pharmas often own sort of generic sections, but they are different models, because the model of big pharma is actually to spend a lot of money and then charge a high price. Whereas the model of the generics is to charge a low price, actually, a much lower price. And so those are two very different models, and the combinations of old drugs falls actually more into the generics pot than it does into the big pharma model.
Gotta go. Thank you, Anthony. That's very instructive. Also, we've talked a little bit about public-private partnerships and who could be involved commercially. Peter, I wonder if you have any perspectives on private investment, and where could that come from, and how could that function to help us with this challenge and maybe bridge the gap between where we are with public funds today and where we are with trying to get private companies to help finish the development and commercialize.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis, and thank you for having me. A very fascinating discussion. About private investment will only come if the private investors have the impression that they are going to make a return on investment on the market. And at the moment, that is not the case. And I fear that the combination of all drugs, it is all going to, even if the investment will be lower than for a brand new product, it will be even more difficult to make a return on investment on the market. So I think unless we get the market fixed, and Jim mentioned the Pasteur Act in the US, which is probably the most single important legislative proposal that is currently discussed by parliaments, because it's because just of the size of the market, the size of the remuneration. There are other markets, there are other countries that need to get their act together and that need to do something. We know that the UK is exploring something, they have a pilot. We see Germany, they have revised the way they fix the price for new reserve antibiotics. So that's positive as well. It's probably not enough, but if it happens in a relatively big market like Germany, you can consider it a small national pull incentive if you want. At least you see that there is a consciousness of the legislator to do something, but we don't see this in other markets that matter. And we need many more high-income countries to do something. And I wanted to say something, I mean, and this is not I really like this approach also to look at all products. I mean, the best example is dexamethasone. The WHO Solidarity COVID-19 trial has proven that dexamethasone, which is a very old generic product, which was used for arthritis and other syndromes, is the only product that currently works to treat COVID-19. And it's a repurposed drug, and it's very cheap to do so. And as Anthony said, we know that this has a good safety profile. And there are many other examples. And the same is, of course, true for combinations. We are using combinations to treat HIV, hepatitis C, TB. This is a very well-established approach. However, what we see also is that this approach is also abused by generic companies who put together irrational combinations of broadband antibiotics just to increase sales. So we have a aware category. I mean, we are recommending antibiotics for use, and we have a whole basket of 107 combinations, irrational combinations of antibiotics that should not be used, that we discourage their use. And that is unfortunately that some companies, which are not research-based, they put together certain antibiotics and push them into the market to convince actually people to use them. And so we really have to differentiate between combinations that make sense, that are adding value. And as Seamus said, this you can of course give to a patient 2 separate antibiotics to actually treat him. And you can then develop these 2 separate antibiotics into fix dose combination, which means that then you really have to provide trials data, go to FDA, EMA to get a marketing approval. And I wanted to pick up, Jim, you said this void of leadership on the international level. I see a glimmer of hope as well, because WHO is going to announce the Global Leadership Group for AMR on 20th of November, probably. And there will be acting prime ministers and acting ministers of health in this group. So we do think that we will get actually a push for global leadership and to get some more action versus discussion.
Thanks, Peter. I have muted myself. I think that's a great perspective, and one thing that always strikes me as easier than trying to pull reluctant private commercial entities and reluctant private investors and reluctant public investors, an easier way to drive success would be success itself. And I think that if we had even one or a few antibiotics companies actually making a profit, actually selling enough to be of interest to either a generics company or a big pharma company, or maybe even a medium-sized or regional pharma company, I think that we could better make the argument that other antibiotics might actually meet that model as well, or even just to try to ultimately, we need to bridge a gap to something, and commercial success is what will eventually get the products used even if they're funded. And I think of two examples. One is Paratek, where I used to work, and the other is Imogen. Both of them helped bridge their funding gaps with the help of BARDA. Imogen relied heavily on BARDA funds. They were probably a third to maybe half of at least their development funds, but ran into a product that had a very small commercial niche. And then they were underfunded to try to commercialize the product as well. And as we know, they're one of the first companies to run into the bankruptcy challenges last year. On the other hand was Paratek, that has a much more broadly potential useful product. They have two indications that could be used arguably fairly early in the treatment course, depending on how they were positioned and priced. And Paratek is having some market success, but without the BARDA funds, they probably would not be able to bridge the gap. And so here's an example where there was a company that maybe was a little bit better set up for commercial success, and leveraged the opportunity to also meet the goals of BARDA, and essentially in partnership with BARDA sort of bridge that gap. And I think that if companies like Paratek, and another one that we probably are all thinking of is a company like Spero, which is also well funded, I think that if those companies can find their way into a successful commercialization model, at least we can talk about returns at one point. Maybe not the types of returns or without some support from public partnerships or nonprofits, but at least we can be talking about potential returns in timeframes that are of some interest to investors. A question from the group prior to this was also, where does Spero fit? Spero is one of a handful of companies that's fairly well funded in the US, and sort of where do they fit into this NCEs versus combinations? And of course, I'm sure most of the people on this call know Spero well, but Spero is a combination of a new carbapenem and a recently launched beta-lactamase inhibitor. And that combination benefits a little bit from being a combination with at least one existing component. They have a little bit easier pathway regulatory-wise in the US and in Europe. In the US, it's the 505(b)(2) pathway. And they leverage a little bit of the safety and comfort of beta-lactamase inhibitors. And so they're an example of a company that's utilizing a combination strategy in order to move a product forward. And so I think that's an interesting benchmark for us to think about going forward. One other question that came up as well, and maybe this is a good one for Anthony, is just if we're going back to relying on old antibiotics, could that be more than just a bridge between NCEs that we want to see get to the market and ultimately be successful so they can be used? Or could they function more as another alternative with maybe a little bit longer lasting opportunity? And do we feel like they will lose their activity against resistant strains as fast as single entities? Or based on your experience in TB, I wonder if you have some perspective on that versus a single agent.
Yes, thank you, Dennis. Well, of course, in quite a number of diseases which have been mentioned before, like tuberculosis, which you've mentioned, and AIDS, and actually you can't use monotherapy. You cannot use a single drug because you get resistance against a single drug. And that's why they use combinations. Now, for some reason that I don't fully understand, the common bacterial infections are often treated with monotherapies. That is one drug at a time. And that is, that is asking for resistance. Now, there's actually a lot of data, particularly in vitro in hollow fibers and with other methodologies, to suggest that if you put two either new or old antibiotics together, you actually get less resistance than you do against one. I won't go into the technical reasons why that is the case, but that has been well shown. And so I predict that one day people will say, actually, you can't market a drug on its own. You have to use a combination. And what will happen, I think, is that people will be able to use combinations of two drugs. This is what happened in TB. They started with two drugs, that's streptomycin and para-aminosalicylic acid back in the 1950s. And then they slowly added over the years more drugs. So now they actually have 4 drugs which are used together to prevent resistance and other properties like shorten the duration of therapy. And the same with AIDS. And I think in the long term, this is what's going to happen for common bacterial infections, that they'll start with 2 drugs, perhaps a new and an old, or perhaps 2 old drugs, and then they'll add, perhaps a 3rd and a 4th in order to get less resistance and to get more properties that they want out of combinations. So actually, I think I think combinations, particularly combinations of old drugs or a mixture, have a good future, a good long-term future, as well as being a bridge.
Thanks, Anthony. One additional question maybe for Peter is, I'm sorry, not Peter, Jim. You mentioned also Brexit and some of the disruptions to, I think, what the EU was trying to do. But Germany just had an initiative that was pretty widely praised with regard to being an AMR R&D hub. And I wonder if there's another route through the G7 or the G20 in order to help get some public resources and enthusiasm behind AMR as a global challenge.
I could talk for hours about this, but I won't. You'll be pleased to know. I wouldn't underestimate both this crisis, but also what seems like a probable change in US presidential leadership. As I'm sure many people know here, there is actually a Saudi Arabian G20 hosted meeting planned for the 21st of November. And I mention that for 2 reasons, because we shouldn't forget that notwithstanding the great initiatives of a number of pharmaceutical companies and biotechs on COVID vaccines and treatments, there has been a complete absence of global leadership on health because of what we have, frankly, in the States. I have in my files a copy of the G20 health ministers' planned statements that never saw the light of day because of the absence of political leaders to cooperate in the past 9 months. But I think we will now start to see that change. I'm not sure if it will lead to anything definitive at the Saudi G20, but the flavor of it will definitely start to improve. Peter mentioned about the WHO's own initiative, which was nice to hear. That I think you said the day before, and I think we'll see a build-up from that. The additional thing related, Dennis, directly to what you asked me, coincidentally, in 2021, the UK is going to be hosting the G7. And in the sort of chaotic post-Brexit search for a global Britain, I think the UK is giving some considerable thought to its role in global health. And from just the various things coming across my inbox, I think AMR is getting back onto the political leadership agenda here in the UK, including the fact that I think I'm right in saying the following year again is Germany. And given that the UK and Germany were probably the 2 most proactive G7 countries on international leadership, it definitely gives a chance for this to come back to the fore. Third thing I was saying, I emphasize I could talk so much more about it, but linked to what I'd said in Peter's follow-up to it, I do believe that if the Pasteur amendment leads to something, this in itself will put enormous pressure on the EU to come up with something themselves as well as other important countries around the world. So in that sense, emphasizing what Peter said, and it was nice to hear somebody so focused on it all, like Peter said, because sometimes I think I'm getting a little bit carried away, but I certainly think that the Pasteur amendments is the single most important policy development on the failed market for new antibiotics that I've seen in the now, what is it, 6 years that I got dragged into this world.
Thanks, Jim. Well, I think we're approaching the end here. I don't know if my co-host Imogen has any final questions or.
We are unfortunately really up against the buffers of time. We've had a lot of questions. I'm very pleased to say a lot of them about fixing the market, which to a certain extent have been addressed. There was a question about the G7 and the G20, which to a certain extent has been addressed. Anthony has just texted me to say that other questions will be answered by email. So I have one because it interested me and it was one of the first to come in, which maybe if we can just run a couple of minutes over, I could ask. And it's from the start, Bob Hancock says he is concerned about combinations. He thinks they're promising, but maybe just a stopgap measure because resistance will still occur, and that maybe we need to start thinking out of the box and look at alternatives to antibiotics, which I'm curious about. Maybe you could all, because you all have got your different areas of expertise, all have a little line about that. And then, unfortunately, we will have to wind up. Who wants to start?
Oh, maybe I go first because I spoke first. No, I couldn't completely. I agree with Bob, but what I would say is a lot of the new non-traditional or novel approaches, a lot of them will be used in combination. So I actually think what we learn from trying to develop combinations of existing products will be applied to how we use novel therapies such as antivirulence agents or pathogenicity blockers, as we're calling them now. I think that's going to be a focus, membrane disrupting agents to allow other antibiotics to get in. So combinations and the way we develop them can be applied to the novel innovative therapies as well.
What about you, Jim? What do you think?
Listen, as I should have said at the start of this, as everybody knows, I just talk about AMR in terms of policy initiatives. When it comes to the science, I know nothing. So I think I shall pass on this question and not kid the audience that I have something useful to say on this topic.
Anthony, we know you know the answer.
Well, I don't know the answer, but I know that Bob makes an extremely good point with which I agree. I mean, for example, in sepsis, I think we would all agree that, yeah, you need an antibiotic, but you need another drug. We don't know what that drug is yet, but we need another drug or drugs in combination to address the serious immune disruption which occurs in sepsis, as it does in COVID, actually.
Peter, World Health Organization?
Yeah, I mean, we are expanding our annual pipeline review where we are looking at all the antibiotics that are in development to these non-traditional products. So we will include phages, the virulence enhancers and other products. And as Seamus said, often they're developed in combination with the classic antibiotics. And let's see whether we will have great successes and maybe new products where bacteria will not be able to develop resistance against. That would, of course, be the major breakthrough. So let's hope for that. But of course, these products have always very high failure rates.
Dennis, last word to you. Perhaps address that question, and then I know you're going to just sum up the discussion briefly as well before we wind up.
Yeah, I don't claim to be the leading edge researcher here. I've spent a fair amount of time in the pure sort of antibacterial space. I think that we increasingly see things like antibodies and vaccines as playing a role. And I think there's plenty of room in this space to defeat AMR with sort of every resource we have. And I think that anything that shows promise should be brought forward. I wouldn't have expected necessarily antibodies, for example, to be potentially effective in COVID-19, not because they couldn't be, just because we hadn't done it to something like a coronavirus. And so I think that we're getting to that level of criticality that we should try everything we can. And I believe that the market will find a way to reward the companies that really do bring effective solutions to this challenge. Unfortunately, we are over. We appreciate all of the interactions from the audience, and as Imogen said, we'll try to send around a response via email from the panelists, and really thank everybody for their participation. We hope there'll be more forums for discussing possible solutions here. I think all of us on the screen believe that the market is currently broken, and the need for new strategies to fight bacterial disease, particularly resistant bacterial disease, is not going to shrink in the near term. It's only going to go in the other direction. So everything we can do to bring all our resources to bear and get ahead of this challenge rather than try to play catch up, as we may have seen over the last 9 to 10 months here, I think would be well reasoned and time and effort well spent. So I just want to thank everybody for joining the webinar, and our panelists, of course, my co-host Imogen, and I bid everybody a pleasant rest of their day.
Thank you.
Thank you.